They built a pipeline straight through my ranch without asking. That morning, I woke to the sound of drills and bulldozers chewing through my cornfield. And there she was, Catherine Doyle, the HOA president, wearing designer boots, smiling like she owned the place, explaining her community infrastructure project to a group of board members nodding along. She talked to me like I was some outdated farmer, too stubborn to understand progress. If only she knew I'd spent 40 years studying groundwater systems before retiring here. If only she realized whose land she was cutting into. When you drill into someone's well, you should know what kind of man you're waking up. The first thing I noticed wasn't the noise. It was the taste of the air, metallic and dry, like soil after lightning. I stepped outside and saw the dirt trembling under the weight of machinery. A steel drill twisted into the ground near my fence, the hum of diesel engines swallowing the quiet that used to cradle this place. My ranch had always been a small, breathing thing. 50 acres of memory handed down from my father. That morning, it felt like someone had driven a knife through its heart. Catherine stood by the orange cones, wearing sunglasses too expensive for the dust she was standing in. Her voice carried over the noise, smooth and confident, rehearsed like a campaign speech. "The Pine Hollow expansion will benefit everyone," she said. "Everyone but me," I thought. The line they were digging cut straight across the old creek bed, the one that fed my well, when I asked for their permit. She smiled that thin politician smile and said, "You'll get a copy once the paperwork's finalized." The men operating the machines avoided my eyes. They were just workers, probably paid by the hour, following orders. Still, I couldn't help but feel every shovel of dirt was a trespass, each vibration another insult. I went back inside and pulled out my father's folder, the one labeled Water Rights, 1974. He had written in his slanted hand, "This land's water runs deeper than any claim." I didn't know then how right he'd been. That evening, I drove to the county office, dust still clinging to my boots. The clerk, a young man with tired eyes, typed my address into his computer, then frowned. "Your file's not showing up," he said. "Might be archived." I asked him to check the paper records, and he disappeared into a back room. He came back 15 minutes later, shrugging. "Sorry, Mr. Hartwell, it's not here." The word missing hit me harder than I expected. A document that had existed for decades doesn't just vanish. Someone makes it vanish. I drove home under a gray sky that smelled like rain. The machines had stopped for the day, but the damage was done. My well water ran muddy when I turned the tap, the clear flow replaced by a brown swirl. I let it run for a while, hoping it would clear, but it didn't. That water wasn't just for drinking, it was memory. The same water my father used to baptize the calves every spring, the same water that filled my mother's kettle when she sang by the window. Now it was poisoned by progress. Catherine called that night. Her number flashed on the old landline like an omen. "Lucas." "Let's be civil," she began. Her voice honeyed. "This project will raise property values for everyone. You'll thank me later." I could almost hear the smile. I said nothing for a long time, then asked one question. "Did you file a permit to cross private property?" Silence. Then a sigh. "Let's not make this complicated," she said. "The HOA has temporary authorization." Temporary. That was her word for stealing. After the call, I sat on the porch, listening to the wind slide across the fields. The moon reflected faintly on the disturbed soil, where the pipeline now cut across my land like a scar. I realized then that Catherine wasn't just overstepping. She was testing how far she could go before someone stopped her, and if no one did, she'd take everything she could reach. I decided she'd picked the wrong boundary to cross. In the days that followed, rumors started. Neighbors avoided my driveway. Someone posted on the community board that I was blocking progress and refusing cooperation. HOA propaganda. Polished and poisonous. Even old Jim from next door waved awkwardly, like he didn't want to be seen talking to me. That's how it begins. With isolation. They make you the problem. so no one listens when you tell the truth. I spent the next night in my workshop, laying out old maps on the table. My father's handwriting marked every ridge, every vein of water. The original wellhead sat 40 feet inside my property line, but according to the new survey Catherine's team filed, that same point now lay within community jurisdiction. I measured twice. They had shifted the boundary, not by mistake, by design. The following morning, I walked the line myself. The air smelled like oil and wet dirt. I followed the trench until it reached the border, then knelt down. The soil was still damp. A faint shimmer of water clung to the edges. It wasn't just water, it was mine. I took a photo, time-stamped it, marked the GPS coordinates on a notepad. Evidence. A small beginning, but something solid. When I turned back toward the house, I saw Catherine watching from her SUV at the end of the road. She waved like we were still neighbors. I didn't wave back. I simply pointed to the ground beneath her wheels, the part of my land she'd already taken, and said quietly, "You'll give it back." Her expression didn't change, but for the first time, I saw the flicker of uncertainty behind her sunglasses. That night, I couldn't sleep. The hum of machinery echoed in my mind, mixing with my father's voice telling me to stand my ground. There's a kind of calm that comes when anger hardens into purpose. By dawn, I knew what I had to do. They had drawn the first line. I would redraw it, with proof, not noise, with law, not fists. The sound of water returned in my dreams that morning, steady, clear, unbroken. When I woke, I wrote one sentence in my notebook: if they want a pipeline war, I'll fight it in the court of truth. And that was the moment the real digging began. The week that followed felt like a quiet storm. No thunder, no rain, just pressure building under every polite conversation. The HOA trucks came and went like clockwork, parking right at the edge of my property line as if they were testing it inch by inch. Catherine's voice carried across the fields some mornings, calm and persuasive. As she gave tours of the community project to her board, she never looked in my direction, but her presence was loud enough. They laid more pipes, sealed more dirt, and soon the old trail my father used to walk became a barricade of metal and concrete. Every inch of that pipe ran through my patience. I tried reasoning first. I wrote an official complaint to the county office, filed under property violation and water access interference. The response came 3 days later, a single sentence that said, "Pending clarification under temporary authorization clause." Temporary again. That word followed Catherine like perfume. I knew enough about bureaucratic smoke to understand it meant no one wanted to touch this mess. I wasn't surprised. HOA presidents like Catherine built their empires on loopholes and signatures. They always smiled while twisting the knife. When I visited the HOA office that Friday, the place felt more like a private club than a neighborhood association. Marble floors, framed certificates, scented air. Catherine greeted me in front of her glass desk with that effortless charm people mistake for kindness. "Lucas," she said, "I'm glad you stopped by. We need to talk about cooperation." I told her cooperation required consent, and she laughed, a low, amused sound. "You're a smart man," she said. "Surely you understand community needs sometimes outweigh personal boundaries." I looked her in the eye and said, "Community doesn't mean trespassing." The air shifted. Her smile froze, but her tone stayed smooth. "You're escalating this unnecessarily. The board won't look kindly on obstruction." She used that word, obstruction, like it carried weight. I realized then she wasn't talking about pipelines anymore. She was laying groundwork for a smear campaign. HOA power isn't built on laws. It's built on whispers, letters, and votes. I left before saying something I'd regret, though part of me wished I had. On the way out, I noticed a framed map behind her desk marked Pine Hollow Development Phase 2. The new lines stretched across my land, cutting through my well, my barn, and straight into the community clubhouse. I took a mental picture. Evidence isn't always paper. Sometimes it's the details you remember while pretending not to see. By Monday, things had changed. Neighbors who used to wave stopped waving. The mailman avoided my porch. I found a notice taped to my gate, non-compliance notice, potential violation of HOA guidelines. It was laughable. My property wasn't even under HOA jurisdiction, yet here they were, extending their reach like ivy. The language in that notice was clever recommended alignment, shared maintenance, temporary easement, legal fog thick enough to make a man trip over his own rights. I knew Catherine's style now. She moved like water, seeping through cracks until the ground softened. That night, I called an old friend, Dennis, who once worked at the county survey office. He owed me a favor from our university days. When I told him what was happening, he hesitated. "Lucas," he said, "I shouldn't tell you this, but that project has state-level attention. Someone high up signed it fast. I asked who. He paused before saying, "The signature belongs to your friend, Sam Porter. Sam and I used to fish together every spring. He worked in infrastructure management, and I'd trusted him like a brother." Hearing his name hit like cold rain. "You're sure?" I asked. "Positive," Dennis said. "But Lucas, be careful. People don't push projects like this unless there's big money underneath." The betrayal burned quietly. Sam must have known what he was approving. Catherine wasn't powerful enough alone. She had backing. Investors. Someone feeding her cover. I sat in the dark, replaying every conversation I'd had with him over the past year. The jokes, the fishing trips, the subtle questions he'd asked about my property lines. It wasn't friendship, it was reconnaissance. My trust had been used as a blueprint. The realization hurt more than the pipeline. 2 days later, the HOA held an informational meeting at the Clubhouse. I went, out of curiosity and anger in equal parts. Catherine stood at the podium under soft lights, talking about sustainable infrastructure and shared community benefits. Behind her was a large digital map showing the pipeline as a bright blue line weaving neatly through the neighborhood, including my land. When I stood up and said, "That line is illegal," every head turned. Catherine didn't flinch. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "we've discussed this privately. You're welcome to submit documentation if you believe there's an error." Her voice stayed calm, her eyes sharp. "Until then, please allow the board to proceed." I could feel the room siding with her, their silence a verdict. After the meeting, a man in a tailored suit approached me quietly outside. He introduced himself as the HOA's legal consultant, name withheld behind a firm handshake. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, "it's best if you avoid making public accusations. Defamation cases are expensive." I smiled without humor. "So is theft," I replied. He left without another word. As his taillights disappeared, I realized what Catherine was doing. She was building a wall of legality around herself, turning my fight into noise. She wanted me angry, loud, reactive. She wanted me to look like the problem. That night, I walked to the edge of my property. The moonlight glinted off the metal pipeline like a blade buried under the soil. I thought about my father, about how he handled injustice. He believed in patience, but not passivity. I picked up a small rock and threw it into the trench, hearing the hollow echo it made. That sound stayed with me, a reminder that beneath all their concrete and contracts, there was still ground that belonged to me. The following morning, I visited the county library and spent 6 hours digging through legal archives. The laws on water rights were clear. Any modification to a private well or groundwater source required consent from the owner and a certified hydrology report. Catherine had neither. I printed copies of the statutes and highlighted every line. My plan wasn't revenge. It was preparation. When power hides behind paper, you fight it with ink. Before leaving, I got an anonymous email from a public computer terminal. The subject line said they filed the wrong coordinates. No signature. Just a set of numbers and a timestamp linking to the pipeline's survey data. I stared at it for a long moment, pulse steady. Someone on the inside was watching. And maybe, just maybe, not everyone was buying Catherine's story. As I stepped out into the fading daylight, I caught my reflection in the glass door for the first time in weeks. I didn't see a victim. I saw a man collecting pieces of truth, one by one. until they formed something undeniable. The wind outside carried the faint scent of rain again, and I realized what it meant. Storms don't ask permission, neither do I. And that night, I began drafting the outline of my counterclaim. It wasn't much, just a few pages of legal citations and maps spread across the kitchen table. But in that quiet room, with the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of water dripping steadily from the tap, I knew the silence was breaking. It wasn't fear anymore. It was the sound of resistance gathering weight, ready to move. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight, soft but relentless, turning the ground into a breathing thing. I stood near the trench where the HOA pipeline cut across my land, watching the runoff snake toward it. Something about the flow was wrong. It bent unnaturally east, uphill against the slope. Water never lies. I crouched and touched the soil. It was colder beneath the surface. Heavier. My father used to say water remembers its path, even when men try to rewrite it. I started thinking maybe he was right. Inside the barn, I unrolled 2 maps across my workbench. One was my father's old survey from the 1970s. Edges yellowed and creased. The other, printed and sealed with the HOA logo, was clean and confident. But when I laid them over each other, the lines refused to agree. My father's stream curved southwest through the oak grove. The HOA's version bent northeast, carving through my property like a wound. The shift measured close to 40 yards. No honest survey makes a mistake that large. Someone had redrawn the earth. That night I called Dennis, my friend at the county office. His voice sounded uneasy. "Lucas, the HOA maps didn't go through our registry. They came from a private contractor, initials LD, not licensed here." After we hung up, I checked the corner of the HOA blueprint and saw them. Faint but real LD, whoever that was. They'd forged approval. I printed copies, locked them in a folder, and marked the date. The rain outside grew heavier, hammering the roof like it wanted to warn me. Early the next morning, I got an anonymous email. The subject line read, "Check the elevations." It contained a single image, 2 coordinate points circled in red, and one sentence, "They don't match the geological record." Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. I replied. But the address was dead. I stared at the map for a long time, realizing someone inside Catherine's circle was leaking information. Guilt makes strange allies. At noon, I drove out to the far edge of my property, where the old creek once bent west before the HOA buried it. The land there dipped slightly, just enough to reveal the old water line when it rained. I used a handheld GPS to record each point, measuring the grade every 100 feet. The results confirmed it. The HOA pipeline cut against the natural flow. They weren't connecting the neighborhood's water supply. They were diverting it. My well had been starved by design. I took photographs, time-stamped and stored them, feeling something cold and sharp settle inside me. That afternoon, I visited William Crane, a retired hydrologist who'd worked for the state before the politics drove him out. His workshop smelled of rust and swamp reeds. I spread both maps on his table. He studied them in silence, tracing the contour lines with a steady finger. "This was tampered with," he said finally. "See that flattened curve? That's a digital shift. They changed the aquifer's boundaries by hand. It's fraud, not error." He looked at me over his glasses. "You could expose them, but they'll come after you harder. Truth costs people money." Driving home through the mist, I passed the clubhouse glowing in the distance. Catherine's silver SUV sat under the floodlight. She stood outside, phone pressed to her ear, calm and poised as ever. But I noticed something in the way she turned quick, deliberate. She already knew I was digging. That kind of power doesn't guess. It listens. When I got home, I filled a glass of water from the tap. It came out cloudy. I let it settle and saw a thin layer of grit swirl at the bottom. Contamination. Proof in its purest form. I opened my father's old notebook and flipped through the water logs he'd kept for 30 years. The drop in mineral stability started 2 weeks ago, the exact day the HOA began drilling. I wrote the number down beside his last entry and closed the book. The fight wasn't about pride anymore. It was about history repeating itself, only this time. I intended to stop it. The next day, I drove to the State Geological Archive. 6 hours of silence, fluorescent light, and dust. When the clerk brought me the Pine Hollow record from the 1960s, I spread it out under the lamp. The tributary lines matched my father's map exactly. The HOA version had no precedent, no permit, nothing. Their official survey was fiction printed on real paper. I scanned every page, saved it twice, and sent a copy to my external drive. When I left, the clerk said, "You're digging into something heavy." "Mr. Hartwell," I told her, "just following the water." Night fell early. I was making coffee when my phone buzzed again. Another anonymous email. This time it had a photo Catherine standing by the trench with 2 men in suits, both holding flashlights. One of them was pointing to a section of pipe near the northern boundary. The timestamp read 9:42 p.m. The caption said only, "They're meeting tonight." I grabbed my jacket, camera, and flashlight, then stepped into the cold. The air smelled of wet earth and metal. When I reached the trench, the floodlights were already on. I hid behind a stack of hay bales, close enough to hear them. Catherine's voice carried clearly through the wind. "We'll fix the paperwork before anyone checks the coordinates," she said. "Just keep the pipe running. I'll handle the signatures." The men nodded. One of them mentioned a shipment arriving next week. I zoomed in and snapped photos until my fingers went numb. When they left, I walked to the edge of the trench. The water below glimmered faintly under the moonlight, thick and dark like oil. I knelt, pressed my hand against the soil, and felt the faint vibration of pressure flowing beneath. The land was still alive, still resisting. My father's words returned to me, quiet and sure. Water remembers. It remembers what's been stolen and who did the stealing. I whispered back, and so do I. As I walked home under the fading storm, my boots left deep prints in the mud that quickly filled with rain. Each one disappeared behind me, erased by the very element I was fighting for. But that didn't bother me. The truth had a longer memory than footprints. It would hold. The next morning, the world felt unnaturally still, like the land itself was waiting. Mist clung to the grass, and the faint hum of the buried pipeline carried beneath my boots. I walked toward the creek bed that once fed my well, tracing the new path of the redirected flow. The water ran thin now, breaking into small trickles over stones that used to shine with life. What the HOA had done wasn't just an act of greed, it was an act of erasure. They had rewritten the earth to fit their map. I knelt and dipped my hand into the cold stream. It was cloudy, heavy with silt, like the ground was bleeding secrets it couldn't hold anymore. That afternoon, I contacted a private survey firm in Helena, a small team of engineers who specialized in environmental audits. The lead investigator, a woman named Dana Morris, agreed to meet me the next day. Her tone was professional but cautious. "We'll do the survey," she said, "but you need to understand that once this becomes official, you'll have to defend it in court." I told her I was ready. I'd already spent weeks defending my sanity. Defending the truth couldn't be harder. The following morning, Dana's truck pulled up beside my barn, carrying 2 assistants and a stack of bright yellow equipment cases. They worked methodically, mapping the terrain, recording water levels, and drilling core samples. By evening, the data was clear. The HOA pipeline cut across 3 sections of unlicensed land, including a protected watershed zone. Dana handed me a printed summary, her face tight with concern. "Lucas, this isn't a simple violation. It's a breach of state environmental law. Whoever authorized this didn't just skip a form, they broke federal code." Her words settled over me like a weight. The damage Catherine's team had done wasn't confined to me anymore. It reached beyond fences and property lines. It was systemic. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my ranch. I was fighting to expose how deep their deception ran. Later that night, I visited the reservoir caretaker. an old man named Harold Flynn who had worked the Pine Hollow water system for decades. He remembered my father. When I told him about the pipeline, his eyes narrowed. That old channel, he said, was never transferred. It's still public domain. If the HOA tapped into it, they're in violation of the state's water code. He rummaged through his cabinet and pulled out a folder thick with maps and permits. Your father and I kept copies of everything, he added. Didn't trust politicians back then. Still don't. Among the papers was a map from 1969 showing the original flow of the Pine Hollow tributary, proof that the HOA's construction crossed territory they had no right to touch. I drove home with the folder resting on the passenger seat, the headlights cutting through the fog like a silent promise. That map changed everything. It meant the HOA's pipeline wasn't just illegal, it was trespassing on state water infrastructure. If I played this right, I could not only reclaim my well, but cut off their entire system. Still, the thought made me uneasy. I didn't want power. I wanted balance. But sometimes restoring balance meant tipping the scale hard enough to make people listen. I spent that night studying every inch of those maps, tracing my finger along the curves of old rivers that had disappeared under construction and greed. The next morning, I returned to the field with Dana's team to collect final measurements. As they worked, the air buzzed faintly, not from machinery but from the quiet tension of knowing what we were uncovering. I watched the data appear on Dana's tablet: pressure readings, flow velocity, contamination levels. The numbers painted a story of theft, diverted flow, unauthorized connections, and structural faults where the pipe entered HOA land. They cut corners everywhere, she said softly. If this goes to the authorities, they'll have to shut it down. I nodded, feeling both vindicated and hollow. Justice always costs something, even when you win. By afternoon, we drove to the county courthouse to file the preliminary report. The clerk glanced through the paperwork, her expression shifting from boredom to unease. You're accusing the HOA of illegal water diversion, she asked. That's a big claim. I told her I wasn't accusing anyone. I was submitting evidence. She stamped the file and passed it back. You'll get a hearing date soon, she said. But be careful. These cases draw attention. As I left, I noticed a black sedan idling across the street, windows tinted too dark for the bright day. When I met its reflection, the car pulled away slowly, vanishing down the hill. That evening, a knock came at my door. When I opened it, a man in a dark jacket stood there holding a letter in a sealed envelope. He didn't give his name. From the HOA legal department, he said before walking off. Inside the envelope was a cease and desist order claiming I was conducting unauthorized geological activity on HOA property. The irony nearly made me laugh. I poured myself a cup of coffee instead, reread the letter twice, then pinned it to the corkboard beside my father's map. The more they tried to silence me, the more proof they gave that they were afraid. Fear was progress. Fear meant cracks in their foundation. I spent the next few days documenting everything. Photos, permits, signatures, all backed up on a hard drive stored in a fireproof safe. When you challenge power, evidence becomes your only armor. Dana's team finished their report, and she promised to testify if needed. Her last words before leaving were quiet but firm. You've got them cornered. Lucas, don't stop now. That night, I walked the length of my property again. The air smelled of rain and metal. At the far end, near the old oak, I could hear the faint sound of running water, my water seeping through the cracks of the redirected channel. I stood there, flashlight steady, as the reflection of the moon shimmered on the disturbed surface. Beneath that calm, something was shifting. The land was remembering its path, fighting to return to the way it once flowed. I thought about my father again, how he believed the earth always reclaims what's rightfully its own. Maybe he was right. Maybe justice was like water, it might get buried, but it never stops moving. It finds its way through the smallest cracks until it breaks free. When I walked back to the house, the lights from the HOA clubhouse glowed faintly across the distance. I could almost hear laughter drifting through the night, the sound of people too certain of their power. I whispered to myself, Enjoy it while you can. Inside, the documents from Harold and Dana sat neatly stacked on my table, ready to be filed with the State Water Board. Tomorrow, I'd make the purchase official, not out of vengeance, but survival. I would buy back the water rights they stole and turn their arrogance into my leverage. As the clock neared midnight, I wrote a single line in my notebook. The river remembers the hand that moved it. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and soil. Somewhere underground, the pipeline hummed like a nervous heartbeat, unaware that the ground beneath it had already started to shift. The day of the HOA meeting arrived wrapped in sunlight that felt wrong. Too warm for late autumn. The sky was polished and blue, the kind of weather that pretends nothing could ever go wrong. I woke before dawn, my hands already steady, my mind clearer than it had been in months. On the table before me lay the folder deeds, survey reports, state letters, and the water rights certificate with my name in black ink. Everything I had built toward this moment was there, across the valley. The clubhouse shimmered in the light like a mirror pretending to be pure. I took a breath and whispered, time to let the water speak. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was full. Neighbors stood in small groups, laughing, unaware of the tide about to turn. Inside, the air buzzed with polite chatter and the smell of coffee. Catherine stood at the front of the room, wearing a navy suit that matched the banners behind her. Progress through unity. They read in gold lettering. Her voice carried easily through the microphone. Today marks a new era for Pine Hollow. Our infrastructure expansion ensures a sustainable future for every homeowner here. I stayed at the back, silent, watching the way she smiled at applause. Confidence looks different when you know it's borrowed. When she opened the floor for comments, I raised my hand. The murmurs died instantly. Catherine's expression tightened, but she kept her tone sweet. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "it's nice to see you participating." I walked to the center of the room, the sound of my boots echoing off the polished floor. I placed a folder on the table in front of her. "Before you continue," I said, "I'd like to submit updated ownership documentation for public record." Her brows lifted slightly, but she waved toward the microphone. "Go ahead." I spoke calmly, every word measured. 2 weeks ago, I purchased full ownership rights to the Pine Hollow tributary, the same source feeding your new pipeline. Here is the certificate of transfer from the State Water Authority. The room fell silent. I could hear the low hum of the air conditioner above us, the shuffle of chairs, a cough from the corner. Catherine laughed lightly, a sound meant to diffuse. "Mr. Hartwell, that's quite a claim. But the HOA's project was approved months ago." I nodded. "Yes, under falsified survey data and without consent from the rightful water owner, which, as of now, is me." A murmur rippled through the audience. I opened another folder, revealing maps and stamped reports. Here is the corrected topographic survey, verified by licensed engineers, showing the pipeline crosses private property and 3 unregistered zones. Here is the letter from the State Environmental Board confirming the violation. And here, I said, sliding the final page forward, is the order from the Department of Natural Resources stating that any further extraction from the Pine Hollow tributary without my authorization constitutes a legal offense. My voice stayed steady, but inside, my pulse was pounding like a drum. Catherine's mask cracked. She tried to laugh again, but the sound faltered. "You expect us to believe you own an entire water source?" I met her gaze. "Not expect, prove." I lifted the certificate so everyone could see the seal glinting under the lights. "This document isn't a story. It's law." She turned toward her attorney, a man in a dark suit who looked suddenly pale. He whispered something to her, but the microphone caught the last part. "He's right." The silence that followed was colder than any argument. I stepped aside and let the document sit there under the bright light, the evidence unblinking. Around me, whispers swelled, neighbors exchanging glances, some angry, some stunned. One man stood and asked, "Is this true?" Catherine. She didn't answer. Her jaw worked as if she were grinding down her pride. "This meeting is adjourned," she said sharply. but no one moved. The spell had broken. Truth has a sound. It's the quiet after authority collapses. When I walked out, the sun had shifted lower, painting the clubhouse windows gold. I could see my reflection mingled with the buildings, like two halves of the same story. Catherine followed me outside, her voice trembling between fury and disbelief. "You think this ends here?" she said. "You humiliated me in front of everyone." I turned, calm as still water. "No," I said. "You did that yourself." She stepped closer, her eyes sharp with panic. "You're making enemies you can't afford." I smiled faintly. "Maybe, but at least I can pay my debts in daylight." I left her standing there as the wind picked up. Scattering the papers, she clutched to her chest. Inside, the crowd had begun to argue, some shouting about refunds, others about accountability. The foundation of her authority was dissolving in real time, like ink in water. I drove home without the radio on, letting the silence fill the cab. The road curved along the creek, where sunlight danced across the ripples. For the first time, the water looked clear again. It was as if the land had been waiting for the truth to breathe. When I reached the ranch, I parked beside the old windmill. The sound of its slow turning matched the rhythm of my heartbeat. I poured a bucket of water from the well, watched the surface settle, then smiled faintly at its clarity. Ownership was no longer a dream. It was tangible, written, sealed, recognized. But the victory wasn't loud. It was measured, quiet, almost sacred. Justice doesn't shout. It flows. Later that evening, I received an email from the State Environmental Office confirming the investigation had been escalated. The HOA was under formal review for illegal water diversion, fraudulent surveying, and unauthorized construction. There would be hearings, fines, maybe even criminal charges. I read the message twice, then closed my laptop. Outside, the air smelled of rain and renewal. The ranch was silent except for the low murmur of the creek returning to its rightful course. As night fell, I sat on the porch with a glass of cold water, staring out at the moonlight stretching over the land. I thought of my father again, of the lessons he taught me about patience and proof. He used to say that the truth moves like groundwater, slow, invisible, but unstoppable. I could almost hear him in the wind, proud but quiet, the way men of his generation showed love through silence. In the distance, faint lights flickered near the clubhouse, but they no longer carried the same weight. The balance had shifted. I didn't feel triumphant, only steady. The fight wasn't over yet, but the ground was mine again, both legally and morally. I finished my drink, set the glass down, and let the night wash over me. Beneath the soil, water moved freely once more, unclaimed, unbroken, and honest. For the first time in a long while, I felt the same. The storm came back that night, as if the sky itself wanted to wash everything clean. Lightning cut across the hills, and the air vibrated with the low hum of thunder rolling in waves. I was in the barn checking the generator when I noticed movement near the fence line. 2 figures, one carrying a flashlight, the other dragging something heavy. I killed the light and watched from the shadows. The rain made it hard to see, but when a bolt lit up the field, I saw Catherine's outline. Her trench coat glistened, and the man beside her carried a crowbar. My stomach went cold. They were heading straight for the pipeline valve. I slipped around the back, keeping low. Every instinct told me this wasn't desperation, it was damage control. Catherine was cornered, and cornered people make reckless choices. When they reached the valve housing, the man pried the cover open, exposing the controls that redirected flow to the HOA's clubhouse. Catherine barked orders through the storm, her voice sharp, desperate. "Just break it," she said. "If we flood the line, he loses pressure, and we can blame faulty equipment." Her plan wasn't just foolish, it was criminal. I took out my phone and hit record. The camera shook in my hand, but the audio was clear. Her words cut through the rain like knives. The man hesitated, glancing back at her. "This is illegal," he said. But she snapped. "So is losing everything." That was the moment she crossed the point of no return. I stepped closer, enough for the camera to catch both their faces under the flicker of lightning. "You don't have to do that," I called out. They froze, then turned. The man dropped the crowbar and ran. Catherine stayed, her eyes wild in the light. "You think you've won?" she shouted. "You've embarrassed me, ruined my reputation. I built this community." Her voice cracked on the last word. I moved forward, steady, rain soaking through my jacket. "You didn't build anything, Catherine. You stole it." She raised the crowbar, trembling, and for a moment I thought she might swing. Instead, she screamed, striking the valve housing. Water erupted in a violent burst, spraying across both of us. The ground turned to mud under our feet. I stepped back as she slipped, falling to her knees, soaked and defeated. The floodlight from the distant barn reflected off the water, turning the chaos into something almost biblical. Then, faintly under the storm's roar, came the sound of sirens. 2 police cars pulled up moments later, their lights painting the rain in red and blue. Officers ran toward us, shouting over the wind. Catherine tried to stand, still holding the crowbar, but one of them shouted for her to drop it. She froze, then let it fall with a dull thud. One of the officers recognized me and nodded. "We got a report from the state board," he said. "Something about tampering with restricted infrastructure." I handed him my phone. "It's all recorded." He took it without a word, then turned to Catherine. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for property damage, unlawful diversion of water resources, and violation of state code." She didn't resist. The fight had drained out of her completely. They put her in the back seat, her face pale under the flashing lights. For a moment, she looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Not a tyrant, not an adversary, just a person stripped of pretense. The rain softened as they drove away, leaving behind silence broken only by the trickle of water from the burst pipe. I stood there for a long time, letting the cold soak through to the bone. It wasn't satisfaction I felt, it was something quieter, heavier. Justice never feels like victory. It feels like gravity. The officers stayed behind to take statements, marking the ground with reflective tape and photographs. One of them asked if I wanted to press additional charges. I said no. The law will handle the rest, I told him. When they finally left, the field was still glowing with scattered light, the puddles reflecting the sky like fractured mirrors. I crouched beside the broken valve and touched the rushing water. It was warm from the pressure, still alive, still moving forward despite the damage. It reminded me of something my father used to say: you can't stop water by breaking the pipe. You just change its course. As dawn crept in, I walked back to the house, the storm dissolving into mist. The horizon glowed faintly pink, a hesitant kind of peace. Inside, I hung my jacket and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window. The world outside was soaked and shining, every surface washed clean. My phone buzzed a message from Dana. News broke early. It said, "HOA investigation now criminal. You did it." I smiled faintly, not at her words, but at the sound of rain dripping from the eaves. It was a rhythm I knew well, one that meant renewal, not destruction. In the distance, I could see the pipeline's path snaking across the field, half buried, half exposed. It looked fragile now, stripped of authority. Soon the state would take control of the system, find the HOA, and repair what they'd ruined. But for me, the restoration had already begun. The land had taken back its truth, the water had reclaimed its path, and the noise of corruption had finally gone quiet. I poured myself a cup of coffee and waited for the sun to rise, watching the light stretch across the wet earth. For the first time in years, the ranch didn't feel like a battlefield. It felt alive. The air carried the smell of wet soil and iron, and the creek outside whispered through its banks like an old friend finding its voice again. Catherine would face her reckoning. The HOA would crumble, and the truth would stand where lies once grew. I didn't need to see it happen. I had already heard it in the sound of the rain. The morning after the storm, the world smelled different. The rain had washed away the mud, the oil, the bitterness. The air was sharp, almost sweet, like the land had been waiting for this cleansing. I walked down toward the creek, the same place where months of conflict had begun. The water ran clear now, slow and steady, carrying fragments of leaves and light. The trench that once divided my ranch had started to collapse under its own erosion, the pipe half buried in its own arrogance. Nature was reclaiming what paper and power had tried to own. The sun rose over the ridge, pale at first, then bold. It hit the surface of the water, turning it into glass. I could see my reflection, tired, older, but lighter. The fight was over. The state had confirmed the ruling 2 days earlier. The HOA's pipeline was to be dismantled, their officers fined, and Catherine charged with fraud and environmental tampering. She faced not just legal penalties, but the slow death of public reputation. For a woman who built her life on control, silence was her real punishment. I did not attend the court hearing. I didn't need to. The truth no longer required me to stand beside it. I spent the following week rebuilding the land. The engineers from the State Department helped redirect the flow of water back to its natural channel. Together we cleared the debris, sealed the broken line, and reinforced the well with new stone. When the final valve was closed, the sound that followed, a long sigh of released pressure, felt like the land itself was exhaling. Dana came by one afternoon, holding a copy of the official restoration notice. She said quietly, "You did it. You turned a lawsuit into a resurrection." I smiled, not because of pride, but because the word felt right. Resurrection. In the evenings, I began planting again, rows of native grass, oak seedlings, and a few fruit trees along the creek's edge. Every shovel of dirt felt like a line drawn under the past. The neighbors who once avoided me started to stop by. Some apologized, others just offered a nod, silent acknowledgement that they had seen what truth could do when it didn't shout. One man, who had voted for Catherine in every election, helped me rebuild the old fence, he said. "Guess the board wasn't invincible after all," I replied. "No one is. They just think they are until the ground reminds them." A week later, I received a letter from Catherine. It was short, written in her perfect cursive. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply wrote, "You were right. I thought I could control the flow. Turns out I was standing in it." There was no return address, just her name and a faint watermark from the county detention center. I folded it once and placed it inside my father's notebook, between the pages that still smelled faintly of river water and tobacco. That's where it belonged. Not as vengeance, but as record, as winter drew near. I opened the well again. The water shimmered in the bucket, pure and cold. I poured a glass and took a long drink. For the first time, it tasted alive. Maybe that was just me projecting, but I believed it. Healing doesn't always look like celebration. Sometimes it's just the quiet moment when what was broken starts working again. The land had memory, and now it had peace. One evening, I invited the remaining residents of Pine Hollow to the property. We gathered near the restored spring, the same spot where the old oak still stood, its branches bending low over the surface of the water. There were no speeches, no banners, just candles and silence. I poured a small amount of water into a clay bowl and said, "This is what truth sounds like when it's not interrupted." A few people nodded. Others wiped their eyes, for the first time in years. That community shared a moment of unity, not born from rules, but from reflection. When they left, I stayed behind. The moonlight slid across the field, silver and soft. I sat on the porch, listening to the creek whisper through the dark. There were no more threats, no more lawsuits, no more documents waiting on the table, just calm. My father's old windmill creaked slowly in the distance, its blades catching the faintest breeze. I thought of how long it had taken to reach this stillness, how much water had to run muddy before it could run clear again. Justice had not been fast, but it had been true. I looked up at the stars and thought about what all of this meant. People like Catherine thrive in silence because good men often stay quiet too long. But silence can also be strength when used with purpose. You don't need to shout to reclaim what's yours. You just need to know where to dig, what to prove, and when to let the evidence speak louder than anger. That's what this fight had taught me. The next morning, I drove into town and filed the last piece of paperwork, transferring part of my water rights to a public trust for future conservation. It was my way of ensuring no one would ever twist it again for profit. When the clerk asked why, I told her, because justice only means something if it stays shared. She smiled and stamped the form. Back home, I stood once more at the edge of the water. The reflection that looked back wasn't a man chasing revenge anymore. It was someone who had learned that victory isn't about punishment. It's about restoration. You can rebuild land, but rebuilding dignity takes longer. Still, it happens, drop by drop. The sun was climbing now, burning the last of the morning mist. I took one last look at the creek before heading inside. Behind me, the water shimmered in quiet defiance, cutting its own path through the soil. I left it that way, untouched. It didn't need my control. It had already found its freedom. That night, I sat by the fireplace and reread my father's notes. His handwriting was uneven, lines of calculation mixed with small personal remarks about rainfall and river bends. I added my own at the bottom of the last page. The land endures when we stop fighting it. I closed the book and placed it beside the window, letting the moonlight fall across the cover. The house creaked softly, a reminder of time passing, but not decaying. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of rain returning from the hills. Life, it seemed, had found its rhythm again. Sometimes I think about Catherine, about what drove her. Maybe it wasn't pure greed. Maybe it was fear, the kind that hides beneath ambition, convincing people that control is the only way to stay safe. Power can make you forget the difference between ownership and stewardship, but losing everything can teach you that lesson in full clarity. She learned it too late, but still, she learned. And in a strange way, that gives me peace. The world doesn't need perfect people, it just needs consequences. In the months that followed, Pine Hollow changed. The HOA disbanded quietly, replaced by a community cooperative run by the residents themselves. No more secret meetings, no more manipulated votes, no more fear of fines for planting the wrong tree. People started fixing their fences together, sharing tools, checking on each other after storms. The place that once stood for control now stood for cooperation. Maybe that was the real justice when people learned to govern not through authority, but through empathy. Sometimes visitors stop by, journalists mostly, asking if I feel proud of what I did. I tell them pride isn't the word. The truth doesn't belong to anyone. It's like water, it just moves toward whoever's ready to hold it steady. I show them the creek, the plants, the well, and tell them the story isn't about victory. It's about balance. When they leave, I sit back on the porch and listen to the water's soft rhythm. That sound is enough. And if there's one thing this story has reminded me, and maybe should remind you too, it's that power without integrity always collapses under the weight of its own lies. But truth, like water, always finds a way to surface. It might take time, it might erode stone, but it never disappears. Justice doesn't come from rage. It comes from patience and proof. When someone takes what's yours, your peace, your voice, your dignity, don't rush to destroy them. Learn the system, use it better than they do, and let truth do the talking. The strongest victories aren't shouted, they're written in law, in paper, in the calm that follows when the storm is over. Here on the HOA Stories, we tell tales of ordinary people standing against small empires of power and arrogance, and winning not with violence, but with reason, evidence, and grace. If this story made you feel that spark of justice, share it, talk about it, and remember that silence can still be strength when it protects the truth. Because in the end, every drop of truth, like every stream of water, will always find its way home.